Okay, so welcome everyone to the Intro to Wetlands webinar. My name is Katie McPartlin. I'm the projects coordinator at Langley Environmental Partners Society, and I'm going to be sort of moderating this. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask that all our watchers sort of stay muted until the end. We'll have some time for questions at the end. And if you have any questions during the presentation, you can also pop them into the chat, which you should be able to find down at the bottom of your screen. And also just to let everyone know that this is being recorded. So while you're welcome to leave your camera on, you just might end up in that recording. So I'm happy to welcome our two speakers today, Katie McPartlin, who is the Environmental Projects Coordinator at Earthwise Agassiz, and Anna MacLeod, who is the Environmental Farm Projects Coordinator at Earthwise Agassiz, and they're going to be talking about wetlands today. And just before we get started, we would like to recognize that this event is being held on the unceded territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, Matsqui, Semiahmoo, and Stolo Coast Salish Indigenous peoples. And with all of that said, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Hi there. As she said, my name is Katie. I am the Environmental Projects Coordinator here at Earthwise. I studied environmental science with a focus on ecological restoration and sustainable agriculture. And my background is pretty broad, a little bit of shorebird conservation, a little bit of agriculture, a little bit of aquatic consulting. Yeah, so that's me, and I'll let Anna introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Anna. I, as Katie said, am the environmental farm manager with Earthwise Agassiz. My background is also in sustainable agriculture. I've been farming for 5 or 6 years now organically. And before that, I was getting my Bachelor of Science in Geography, Environmental Studies, and Botany at the University of Victoria. So I am very passionate about plants. I love talking about plants and making other people love plants as much as me, and food and people. So yeah, excited to be Earthwise.
All right, I'm gonna try and share my screen here.
Yeah.
So hopefully this works okay. Let's see. Oh, geez, Louise. Okay. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So Earthwise Society, if you are not familiar with us, we are an environmental education organization, a nonprofit. We have a site in Delta and also here in Agassiz. We focus on cultivating sustainable communities through stewardship and education. Yeah, so, oh, looks like it's, there we go. So we just had a chat question, and we're curious to see why everyone's attending today. So if you could answer in the chat what brought you here today, that would be amazing. I would love to see some of those answers. Yeah. Okay, and while you're doing that, a quick land acknowledgement. So we are coming to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded shared territory of the Shem, Stollies, Squillets, and Seabird Island people. Okay. And environmental conservation is one of the answers we have. That's really, really great. We're definitely into that here at Agassiz and Earthwise. So a little bit of the outline today. I'm going to go over the basics of wetlands, what they are, the values that wetlands provide, and the different types of wetlands. And then Anna is going to get into the history of wetlands and farming in wetlands, as well as our site here. Okay. And as mentioned, we're going to keep you on mute, but when we ask a chat question, feel free to unmute and answer verbally or through the chat. And we will have a few more polls and chat questions throughout. So yeah, feel free to answer those. Okay. So definition of wetland. So this is a very, very simple definition, but a transitional area between states of always wet and always dry. There's a large gradient of wetland types, some holding more aquatic communities, some more terrestrial communities. There are three main characteristics that define an area as being a wetland. And the first is that the hydrology results in wet or flooded soils. The second is that soils are dominated by anaerobic processes, so processes without oxygen. And the third is that biota, especially flora, are especially adapted to wet and anaerobic conditions. Okay, so this is actually our first poll question before I get into the wetland classification. So true or false, marshes and swamps are characteristically very low in nutrients and very acidic. So I'm just going to launch this poll question. See if that works. And we have someone else who answered the first chat question. She lives on a lake and creek in Manitoba and would like to learn about how to take care of her wetland. That's amazing.
Great, yeah. Yes.
Nice. And dealing with invasives in wetlands, that is definitely a challenge for sure. Okay. It looks like half of us have answered. I'll give you another minute to answer your poll if you're there. Okay. So it looks like I'm going to end the poll. I don't want to have you sitting there too long waiting. So it looks like majority of people said false, which is true. False is true. So marshes and swamps are actually the opposite. Bogs and fens are very acidic and very low in nutrients. So bogs and fens are considered organic wetlands. They have an accumulation of peat moss and organic matter, and they often don't have a lot of overland flow input. Their main water input is from rainwater. So that results in very anaerobic, acidic, and low nutrients. Whereas swamps, marshes, and shallow water wetlands, which are the other three classification types here in BC, those are mineral wetlands. They often have a lot of input from overland flow and therefore have a lot of nutrients. Yeah. Next slide here. So wetlands come in all different shapes and sizes. Those are the five main classification types. But these are just other types that you'll see around. So forested wetlands. Let me just move this here. Sorry. So they're similar to swamps, but just with less standing water, permanent standing water. And then we have wet meadows, which are due to fluctuating water levels within an open water basin, and they're dominated by sedges and grasses. We have ephemeral ponds, which are also called vernal pools, and these are seasonal pools of water, often found on the forest floor, and they are often overlooked. Basically looks like a puddle, but they're actually really significant habitat. And then the last one there is coastal wetlands. That comes in all different shapes and sizes: mangroves, mud flats, even kelp and seagrass can be considered a wetland. All right. So riparian zones. So these differ from wetlands a little bit. You can actually have wetland ecosystems within your riparian zone, and riparian zones themselves can have wetland characteristics. So these are the transitional areas between waterways and upper land areas. And this is our next poll question. So let me see if I can launch this one. I might not be able to.
I can if you
And
want.
you can? Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
I have not figured out how to launch this one. But basically, we're just curious who has wetlands and streams on their property. It looks like a few of you have already said in the comments that you do, and that's really, really great to hear. Okay, yeah, it looks like a lot of people have both wetlands and streams, and some of you have none as well. That's great. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so it's 50-50 both and none, so that's interesting there. Okay. So I'm going to get into a little bit about our site here at Agassiz. So we have various different ecosystem types here. We have an old growth forest, we have a 2-acre teaching farm, an organic farm, and we also have open meadow, and we have about 2 acres of restored wetlands and restored riparian zone along Miami Creek. So on our property, we have Tillicum Creek, which is a very small tributary that runs along the steep cliff face, which you can see here. And that image is actually of a constructed wetland or restored wetland that was done in partnership with Fraser Valley Conservancy and Mike Pearson from Pearson Ecological. He has a consulting firm and does really, really great work. So we also have Miami Creek running through our property, and these 2 creeks converge at the northern edge of our property. Yeah, so we really love restoration here, and it's really an ongoing project and long-term management of these spaces and removing invasive species and planting natives. So Anna's going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but that's just a little introduction. Okay. Values of wetlands. The values are immense. They go on and on and on. But one of the best values, I think, is the amount of diversity and biodiversity that these ecosystems hold. So these are actually really, really important spaces for birds, especially along the Pacific Flyway. So if you can see on that map there, that pink highlighted section on the map is the Pacific Flyway, which is a migration route that thousands of birds take biannually. And wetlands act as resting sites and sites for birds to re-energize and even breed. So very important ecosystems. I believe, I have to double check, I think these were Western sandpipers in the photo. Whoa, okay, sorry. Let me just go back here. There we go. All right. Yeah, Western sandpipers from Boundary Bay there. And then we have an image of a wood frog. So I put that there because that frog species actually specifically breeds in ephemeral ponds and vernal pools. So that's where those specific wetland types are actually really important to certain species. And then wetlands also support a large amount of endangered species. Oregon spotted frogs are one in this area, Agassiz Harrison, and I'm not sure if there's any sites near Langley, but there might be a population near Langley. So Oregon spotted frogs, if you're not familiar with them, are the most endangered Canadian frog species, and they're quite cute. And our wetland doesn't actually have any egg masses in it, but the restored wetland is a potential site for them to go to in the future. So hopefully that would happen in the future. All right, carbon sequestration. So wetlands are really, really great at storing carbon and taking carbon out of our atmosphere. You can see on the infographic there, they're one of the most effective ecosystems at actually doing this process, which is really, really important in times of climate change. Yeah. All right, so provisioning services. Wetlands provide really, really important habitat for some of our economic important industries. So fisheries and salmon fisheries specifically in this area are one, as well as peat moss. So peat moss, we actually, I've got to find the statistic, but I think it was, can you see the statistic on the outline, Anna, for how much peat moss sorry.
Annual Canadian peat production is
Oh, I see it.
1.34 million tons.
Yeah, so a lot. It's not necessarily good for wetlands by any means, but it's certainly an economic vantage point of wetlands. And then they provide a lot of cultural services. So I personally love to spend time in wetlands and birdwatch. They provide a lot of recreational opportunities, as well as cultural significance to a lot of the Indigenous communities around here. The two images on the left are one traditional fishing practices, and the other is wapato, which is a plant that used to be harvested for its root. Yeah. And arguably one of the most important values that wetlands provide for us is flood mitigation. So this is actually the constructed wetland that we have here on our site. As you can see, it is quite flooded. This is back in November. Our boardwalk is underwater, but that is okay because that is what the wetland is there for. It's there to hold and absorb water. They act like a sponge on our landscape. And this is just really, really important, again, in times of climate change and for Fraser Valley in general, because we are in such a low-lying area. Yeah, so I have a chat question. I'm just curious who was affected or if anyone was affected by the flooding in November.
And if you're not from BC, we had a very intense flooding of the Abbotsford to Chilliwack area this past November.
I'll just wait a minute. If anyone was affected, I would love to hear about it. Again, I think our farms were actually quite protected from the wetland and the riparian zone, which is really, really great. I think it did its job well, which is good. Someone's girlfriend's basement was flooded. That's not great. Someone's son was affected. Yeah, so definitely something we do not want happening, and wetlands can definitely be a solution to that. Okay. So I'm gonna pass it off to Anna if you're ready, Anna.
I am ready. All right, so another service that wetlands provide is replenishing groundwater aquifers. So in a wetlands process of slowing down overland water flow, seepage occurs, and this is how groundwater aquifers can be replenished. This can be especially significant in the upper parts of a watershed, where initial catchment and storage act as kind of a first line of defense against excessive overland flow, which results in flooding and erosion. And this replenishment of groundwater is important because it can provide a more consistent water source for plants and animals and even human systems. And this picture here is of the Silverdale Creek wetland outside Mission. Just on the next slide here. And wetlands also are considered the kidneys of a landscape, and this is due to their water purification abilities. So this is another extremely important ecosystem service that wetlands provide, the filtration and purification of water. And they're often referred to as the kidneys of the landscape due to their kind of high and long-term capacity to filter pollutants from the water that flows through them. So they have this ability to carry and slowly deposit sediments, kind of like you see on the deposition banks of like a meandering river system or a braided river system. They can also trap and recycle nutrients, and they can uptake and store contaminants as well. And all of these processes really aid in improving water quality and attachment. Issues of sedimentation, nutrient loading, and pollution from pesticides or hormones and antibiotics can be especially prevalent in agricultural landscapes. So that's why it's really important to be maintaining these wetland ecosystems and also creating kind of riparian buffer zones, which can be a really vital tool in moving your agricultural system in a more sustainable way. That being said, these systems can only do so much. So it's still incredibly important for kind of farmers to always be consistently analyzing their growing practices and how they're affecting their surrounding natural areas. kind of like a wetland or riparian buffer zone type situation can coincide really well with, say, like a small scale organic agriculture system, but maybe it wouldn't be quite as suitable for like a large scale industrial factory farming type agriculture system. It just probably wouldn't be enough to, you know, keep up with like the huge amounts of fertilizers and pesticides and stuff used in that kind of farming practices. Also, additionally, we know everything kind of runs downstream, so it's very important to be constantly monitoring water quality throughout a catchment. And this can really help to address where the root of a pollutant is originating from, but it can also help to exemplify really how contaminants really do increase in concentration as you continue to move downstream. For example, our local Miami River, which runs through a number of agricultural lands, housing developments, and as well as the town of Harrison Hot Springs before it reaches Lake Harrison. So that's why it's really important that there's just like very sustainable and responsible land management practices at kind of all of these stops along the way to ensure that the water flowing into Lake Harrison is a really clean and healthy flow. I just a quick chat question. Does anyone on their farming practices utilize kind of wetland or riparian buffers, or is this something that is somewhat prevalent in your areas, or yeah? Doesn't look super prevalent in the chat. That's okay though, because it is difficult. It's kind of a daunting process to come at from a farming standpoint. So we're just going to talk about now the history of wetlands. So wetlands have notoriously had a prevalent history of being viewed kind of as wasted space. So yeah, environmental groups began kind of advocating more so for significance of these ecosystems, and more protective legislation was put in place. But still, channelizing and draining of wetlands is still pretty commonplace, especially in agricultural and urban landscapes. And we think it's really important to see examples of these agricultural systems that are coinciding really well with wetlands, or utilizing wetlands in a kind of more sustainable way, both for the farmer and for the wetland ecosystem. In the more densely populated part of BC, 60 to 98% of the original wetlands have estimated to been drained and filled. And in the less populated kind of northern central regions of the province, significantly greater amount of wetlands remain. So we see this kind of direct correlation between increasing humans and a decrease of wetlands, which we are trying to avoid. We're trying to have humans and wetland environments kind of coinciding. Another common manipulation of wetlands is channelization. So this is when kind of a naturally meandering or winding stream or river is transformed into a straight dugout channel. And this is often done to make more space for development or for agriculture. But this meandering kind of nature of creeks and rivers is super beneficial because it really helps to slow the energy of overland water flow and absorb slowly along the way in a watershed. And it also kind of aids in sediment deposition, like you see on sandbars or deposition banks. And this can be a really vital habitat for spawning fish, or like breeding amphibians, or even nesting birds. And this practice of channelization and disconnecting the various streams and kind of tributaries along a floodplain can be really problematic, especially in terms of flooding and erosion. And this is due to that really high energy of water flow when it's confined to that straight channel of water like that. We had this process occur along the Miami River here in Agassiz, pretty much for the whole way along the Miami River, including on our property in Agassiz. So we were really trying to kind of remediate the natural riverway and shape as best as we can. We've added several kind of like gravel bars to several areas, and these have been hotspots for coho salmon spawning, which is pretty cool. These pictures you see on the screen here, this is an example outside Abbotsford. The property owner here channelized his portion of the headwaters of the Salmon River, which is a super important fish-bearing stream that flows into the Fraser River at Fort Langley. So as you can see from these pictures, erosion can be extremely problematic on these banks, just from these high cut banks like that. And you also see that there's kind of no vegetation surrounding on these river banks. Vegetation can also really help to counteract erosion because the roots can really keep the soil in place. So this was really problematic. There was a lot, really high sediment load in the water, and it was kind of clouding out all of the salmon spawning gravel, and there was a lot of agricultural pollutants as well going downstream because there was none of that vegetation buffer. So yeah, it's very problematic, not just on your site, but you have to think of everything kind of downstream from you as well. Locally, so a lot of the Fraser Valley kind of has a similar story of wetland degradation and destruction for farming and urban development. Just some statistics, like 2/3 of BC's population is living within the Fraser River Basin, and 50% of BC's sustainable timber yield, 60% of BC's metal mines, 90% of BC's gravel extraction all occur within the Fraser River Basin. And 20% of BC's farmland uses water from Fraser River tributaries for irrigation. And to contrast, 70% of the Fraser River's estuary wetlands have been diked, drained, and filled to reclaim land for development. So we're beginning to kind of see how this lack of these beneficial wetland ecosystems throughout a catchment basin likely contribute to excessive flooding, like what we saw in November there. And many species are also heavily reliant on these wetland riparian ecosystems. This image here is showing the occurrence of coho salmon in the lower Harrison River watershed. You might traditionally think of like a traditional salmon spawning water body, and you think of a large river or an estuary, but coho salmon are extremely opportunistic and have been known to spawn in very small headwaters and even like drainage ditches. And we have witnessed salmon in our portion of the Miami River as well as in our Telecom Creek. So it's pretty cool. All right, more so now about farming and wetlands. So yeah, like we were talking about, traditionally, it wouldn't be considered effective or beneficial to mix farming and wetlands, both for the agricultural system and for the wetland. So kind of like a one or the other scenario. Wetlands are extremely biodiverse and work really well at holding and storing nutrients. So often these areas create very nutrient dense landscapes, which are also consequently seen kind of as the perfect places for agriculture and growing. The Fraser Valley is one of the most fertile areas in Canada, super excellent growing conditions and unparalleled soil fertility. And this is largely due to its location on the Fraser River Basin. However, this lack and removal of wetlands in an agricultural landscape has caused a lot of challenges for farmers and ecosystems alike. Agricultural runoff is one of the largest water pollutants, and sedimentation and eutrophication, which occurs from nutrient loading due to over-fertilization of farms or excessive animal manure and waste making its way into a water system, can create these large kind of algal blooms like you see in this picture here. Algal blooms create extremely anoxic conditions, so conditions lacking oxygen. They really reduce water quality and they increase temperatures. So it really just acts to completely kind of choke out the plant and animal diversity that existed previously. Also, pesticides and antibiotics and hormones also have this ability to kind of increase in concentration exponentially throughout a food chain. This is known as biomagnification. It has very detrimental impacts, especially on our large apex predators like bears who feed in these aquatic areas. And all of these processes really just act to kind of reduce water quality that is very important for native species like the salmon that are so kind of indicative and important to our areas here. And likewise, farmers are also seeing really negative impacts of wetland diversions and drainings, like irrigation issues like desertification are becoming more prevalent every year, or the opposite, where landscapes kind of lack that sponge-like quality that wetlands provide, that slowing energy of overland flow. And this can result in erosion issues or flash flooding events that can be really damaging to infrastructure. So yeah, we think it's important to kind of look at sustainable applications and values of wetlands in farming. Things like constructed wetlands, like swales or spillways upland, can be used to hold water and replenish groundwater aquifers, as well as aiding in preventing runoff and erosion. And also utilizing or creating kind of riparian buffer zones at water bodies in the lower parts of a farm landscape have the ability to purify runoff of major sediments and contaminants before it makes its way into the greater watershed. All right, on our Agassiz farm, we have placed a large focus on developing our farming site in a way that supports or maintains our restored wetlands and riparian ecosystems. So this picture here is showing the west side of our property, which features a large constructed wetland. Like Katie was saying, that was built with the consultation of Mike Pearson, our local biologist in the area. It was evident on our site from the residual plant communities like Western Spirea and red osier dogwood, water birch, paper birch, that historically the riparian zone on our property was a lot larger. And the creeks and river kind of had a more braiding, meandering nature to the two streams, meaning they kind of met up and separated and took up a lot more space on the property than they currently do now. Currently, they for the most part, meet up at the northern edge of the property, but we're trying to kind of counteract that right now. When we developed our main growing field, which is kind of just to the left of this picture here, we had the field graded. So the whole field slopes slightly towards the far northeast corner. This way, when there's excess water on the land, it all kind of flows to this area where we created a swale. And this swale was planted with kind of wetland specific native plants. And the swale, as well as the plant communities, really help to kind of slow that energy of the overland water. And it slowly absorbs into the ground there and then kind of redirects it towards the Miami River on the eastern border of the property. So we're really trying to reconnect these two water flows in a more kind of natural way, utilizing our information of how wetlands work and how water absorption works and all sorts of things. So this has really immensely helped our growing fields from preventing flooding, or if there is flooding that occurred, it kind of absorbs away from the areas that we need it to. So next we're just gonna show pictures of some plants here. Do these plants look familiar to anyone? Like, has anybody utilized these plants on their property or? Katie, do you mind reading the chat out? I just can't see the chat responses if anybody.
Oh yeah, for sure. So yeah, these are 3 natives that we also use in innovations. They're really, really great for bank stabilization. Yeah, so if you can identify them, I welcome you to answer that in the chat. It's a little bit tricky. Some of them look familiar, is one of the responses.
Okay. So what we are seeing here, some in our area, great. Yeah, these are all, so these are 3 types of plants that are very prominent on our property here in Agassiz. On the left, we see the red alder. Red alder is a really great wetland tree, really bank stabilizing root system. And it also, red alder is kind of interesting because it has kind of association with this filamentous bacteria called acetominosites. And these actually kind of invade the alder's root hairs and they create nodules, which actually can help with nitrogen fixation. So kind of interesting. You'll also see in the middle there, these are 2 species of willow. We on our property have the Hooker's willow and the Pacific willow, and willows can root really easily. So they're really great in restoration projects. And they have a really stabilizing root base as well. So really great to hold erosion on stream banks. And then lastly, we see the red osier dogwood over there, and it's a very beautiful species, also working really well at preventing erosion in wetland areas. And then the next slide, we have some some more invasive species. That these are 3 invasive species that are very prominent on our property. Are these prominent on anyone else's property or spaces? They can be pretty common. They're pretty common invasives, particularly in BC. Yeah, Himalayan balsam, that's right. Policeman's helmet is another term for that one there. Yeah, 2 in our area. Yeah, these ones are pretty out and about everywhere. Himalayan blackberry, that's correct. Yeah, very, very strong and powerful blackberry that can be very hard to deal with in terms of invasives because of those huge big thorns. Yeah, so these plants can be kind of problematic. The one on the left, the grass here, that's the reed canary grass. Reed canary grass, we see a big problem on our property. It grows this kind of very thick rhizomous sod layer, and it can just completely choke out native plants. It can make it really hard for amphibians to travel through the grasses, and it can grow so thick it can even result in like redirecting stream flows. So that's a really problematic one. The Himalayan balsam is also pretty interesting as it grows really fast and it can grow very tall. So it grows really tall, really fast, and kind of shades out all of the native plant diversity underneath it and kind of killing off all of these native plants. And also it's very problematic because it has a very shallow root system. So it takes out all these plants that kind of have more stabilizing root systems, and then it has a very shallow root system, so it can create a lot of erosion issues, especially on banks as well. I think I saw someone talking about Himalayan balsam. Yes, yeah, I've heard. Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say, there's a chat here from Freya saying that she wrestles with blackberry a lot on her creek. We do as well. Yeah, and she says she's worried about the need to replace it with something that can stabilize the bank. So again, definitely willow is a really, really great species for bank stabilization, especially quickly. They send shoots down really, really fast. But there are certainly all sorts of natives that are good for that. Yeah.
I've also heard, I saw somebody mention the yellow flag iris, and I've heard from other people in our area that that's a really problematic one. We are lucky and don't have so far that we've seen much of the yellow flag iris, but I have heard that that can be really problematic as well. Okay, so now we're just going to talk a little bit more about kind of individual land use decisions. More so kind of on your properties. If you don't have a farm, can relate to if you have a farm as well. At Earthwise, we're really big on kind of encouraging people and with the belief that individual choices really do matter. So we're really working to educate and empower people to make sustainable land use decisions that work for them and work for the surrounding ecosystems and natural areas. In the context of watershed and water quality management, this can look like developing rain gardens, which can really aid in collecting and preserving stormwater runoff, really helps to maximize water conservation in gardens. We actually at Earthwise are implementing a rain garden on our farm this year. We have a whole water conservation series coming up in April, and we talk all about how to make rain gardens. We invite volunteers to come help us with the creation of our own rain garden. Yeah, there's also xeriscaping, which is the practice of creating landscapes that reduce or eliminate the need for irrigation. So like more desert style. And if you have a waterfront property, you can also make the decision to kind of leave naturalized shorelines. Shorelines are really important transitional zones for plant and animal life, especially like nesting birds and amphibians. And this can also act as that buffer zone like we were talking about between human activity and the natural ecosystems. And this is beneficial for the ecosystems, but it can also be beneficial for you and your property in terms of kind of like water level rise and flooding and things like that. You can also choose to preserve upland ephemeral ponds. So these small seasonal ponds that are really significant to some amphibian species, especially. Like Katie was saying, like certain frog species, like the wood frogs, they only breed in these fishless ephemeral ponds. And many salamanders also really rely on this habitat.
I should have mentioned earlier too, in our constructed wetlands, we had just done an egg mass survey, and I think there's at least like 32 northwestern salamander egg masses. I think there was about 10 red-legged frog egg masses. So this habitat has only been there for, a handful of years, and it's already creating really, really great space. So it doesn't have to be a lot of space, but it can be very, very valuable habitat for sure.
Totally, totally. Yeah, there's lots of things you can do, like choosing to be educated and informed about sustainable land management practices and kind of what your local ecosystems really need to operate and what they need to survive and flourish.
Okay. Okay, so we just wrote down a few potential resources. If you do have a farm property, Ducks Unlimited is a really, really great nonprofit that often provides financial incentives and or consulting. They have a cover crop program where they provide financial incentives to those looking to put winter cover crops on their land. They also provide consulting and sometimes financial incentives to people looking to do wetland restorations on areas that were previously wetlands, which in Fraser Valley is probably a lot of area. And then they also do range enhancement incentives, which is financially supporting people to install fences mainly along riparian zones to prevent cattle from damaging creek systems. The environmental farm plan that was mentioned by a previous speaker with LEPS. It's a really, really great resource, and they often provide environmental risk consulting for farmers and farmland. Checking out local nonprofits like LEPS is a great idea, of course. And then Environment and Climate Change Canada also provides some funding for landowners if their habitat is critical habitat for species at risk or critical aquatic habitat. Yeah, so those are just some good resources to check out. Here is our website in case you're curious about any of our upcoming workshops or volunteering. And then our email, if you have any questions about this webinar, please feel free to email us. And we're at questions and answers. So if anybody has any questions about their own property, about Earthwise, about the webinar, please put them in the chat and we would love to hear them.
And also just additionally, while we're waiting for people to kind of write their questions, I really encourage you, if you're interested in Earthwise and kind of the projects that we do, if you head over to our website, you can sign up to be a volunteer, or you can sign up to be on our mailing list. And this way you can kind of see all of our upcoming projects and activities and events, and yeah, come and volunteer if you really want to as well.
Okay, so I do see a question here from Jamie. She says, I've heard a lot about permaculture practices. How does this connect to wetland conservation? I'm going to let Anna speak to this because she has her permaculture certification. So how does permaculture practices connect with wetland conservation?
Yeah, permaculture practices. So that's a very broad term. Like permaculture is kind of, it's a system of, it's like sustainable agriculture could be considered permaculture as well. So I think choosing to grow sustainably and organically is always kind of a benefit to your surrounding ecosystems. But learning about more different permaculture practices can be really great for preserving wetland conservation and any ecosystem conservation. Really just really reduces your impact on kind of your surrounding environment.
Okay, so another question here. They farm on a property that is mostly dedicated to horse boarding, and I think the horse boarding has a much greater impact on our waterways. What resources are there to help that kind of operation minimize their environmental impact?
Yeah,
that is a really great question. So as I said, the environmental farm plan might be a good resource in terms of looking at different areas on your property that are very risky, environmentally risky. And Ducks Unlimited, that incentive program, the range enhancement program might be a good idea to look at. I don't know, Katie, if you have any.
This also seems like a really, a property like that seems like it could really benefit from more of creating these like buffer type scenarios, like creating a riparian buffer zones around like your areas that you think have the most impact. I feel like that could be something that could be really beneficial.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, if somebody does like have horses on their property or is a small farm owner, LEPS is going to be doing on-farm consultations, free on-farm consultations. So anyone who's interested in that could just send an email to me at projects@leps.bc.ca, or just go onto our website and you'll be able to find more emails, just agriculture as well. So yeah, there's also that as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's really awesome.
I see another question about beavers in the area. Apparently, they have to use wire enclosures around their plantings. Are there any natives that beavers will leave alone? Not to my knowledge, but Anna, I'm not sure if you heard of any.
Yeah, I'm trying to rack my brain right now. I don't know. Beavers seem like a lot of different types of woods and plants. I'm assuming that the plants like that you're talking about are kind of like the larger woody plants, unless they eat also like greens. I'm trying to think of some plants that are kind of, I know plants that are deer resistant, but I don't know about beavers, unfortunately.
I've also heard of people putting up fencing around their planting areas as well to prevent beavers from getting in there.
Yeah. I wonder if you could also do some sort of like utilizing, I know a lot of people like to build like gardens adjacent to their food gardens that are like a trap crop is what we call them sometimes. And it's like a plant or a fodder that is really like appealing to a deer or a beaver, so that it kind of goes after that trap crop as opposed to like your other more precious plantings. Something to consider.
Okay. So if there's no more questions, I mean, on behalf of Earthwise, I'd definitely like to thank everyone for coming and listening and wanting to learn about wetlands with us. Yeah, and thank you, Leps, for having us here, and Katie for hosting.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much, Katie and Anna. That was a really great, informative presentation. There's like so much information in that.
There was a lot of information.
And there will be a recording of this presentation available. So if anyone wants to go back and review it, that will be available on the LEPS Facebook and LEPS YouTube page as well. And before everybody leaves, I'd just like to say that you will be receiving, all our participants will be receiving an email that has a link to a webinar feedback form, and we really appreciate if you could fill that out. And if you are a farm owner or a land owner in the Langley and Abbotsford areas, we have another survey on watershed quality in these areas that we would also really appreciate if you could take the time to fill them out. But yeah, once again, thank you so much to our speakers. That was a really great presentation, and I can see lots of people in the chat saying thank you and that it was very informative.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, if nobody has any more questions, we're getting close to the top of the hour. So say thanks one more time and have a great evening, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.